The light came back wrong. That was the first thing Mara noticed when the cryo-seal cracked and the stale recycled air hit her tongue. Not the cold, not the ache in her joints that felt like someone had been quietly replacing her bones with broken glass while she slept. Not even the emergency amber washing everything in the color of old bruises. It was the light through the porthole. It was the wrong color. The sky outside had been blue when she went under. 207 years later, it was the color of a deep old scar. She sat up too fast and paid for it, with a full minute of gray at the edges of her vision. The chamber smelled of ozone, and something faintly organic she didn't want to identify. Around her, 11 other cryopods stood in their cradles, each one sealed, each one dark. She was the only amber. She was the only one who had come back. Unit Vasquez, Specialist First Class, she said to the room, because the protocol said to identify yourself on revival, and Mara Vasquez had followed protocols since she was 19 years old. Voice came out as a rasp, barely a voice at all. It sounded like the last broadcast from a dead station. She swung her legs over the edge, and her boots touched a floor that was no longer level. The whole installation had shifted, tilted maybe 4 degrees to the north. 2 centuries of settling, or impact, or something she wasn't ready to name. She found her equipment locker, found it undamaged, dressed methodically, checking each seal and buckle the way she always had. Not because she was calm, but because calm was a performance she had learned to give so convincingly, she sometimes convinced herself. The door to the surface required the emergency hand crank. She cranked it. Outside, the world did not welcome her. The colony of New Crestfall had been built on a plateau in what had been one of the most geologically stable regions of Kepler 442b. The colonists, 2,411 of them, she knew the number the way she knew her own rank, had spent 11 years terraforming it before the first families arrived. She had been part of the defense detail during the third wave. She had watched children learn to walk on alien soil and treat it like home. Because it was home, because they hadn't known anything else. Now, the plateau was a plain of fused glass and calcite-pale structures that had once been buildings. The alien geometry was immediately recognizable. The Veth did not destroy things the way humans did. With fire and explosion, they compressed. They folded matter until it was small and dense and silent. The way you press a flower in a book, and what comes out is still a flower technically. But all the life has been pressed out of it. New Crestfall had been pressed. Mara stood at the top of the installation's ramp and looked at it for a long time. She was not crying. She had no water to spare. Then she picked up her kit, checked her sidearm, and started walking. Because the mission parameters said to assess. Because she had been sent here, 2 centuries ago, on a ship that probably no longer existed, to assess and report. Because she did not know what else to do. And doing nothing felt like a different kind of death. She walked the way the robot in the old Belgian short had walked in the children's media archive she had watched during transit. That 7-minute animated film, one of the kids had played on loop in the common room. With a gait that was equal parts function and grief, each step a small argument against stopping. The Veth were watching her. She knew this. They had been in the system when she went under, and they were clearly still here. You did not glass a colony and then leave. You stayed to be certain. She could feel the observation the way you feel the sun on the back of your neck. Not painful, just present. Just the constant awareness of being seen. She did not change her pace. First thing she found intact was a weather monitoring array at the colony's eastern edge. The second was a water reclamation tank, still functional, still cycling. She drank from it without ceremony, flat on her stomach on the glass plane, with her face in the outflow pipe. And she thought, 2 things. 2 things out of 2,411 people and 11 years of work. 2 things were left. She was possibly a third. She catalogued the ruins for 6 hours before she found the signal. It was faint, short-range, encrypted in a comm protocol that predated her cryo by at least 40 years. Old enough that she had to work through the decode from memory, running the algorithm in her head the way you solve arithmetic when there's no paper. It was coming from below, beneath the glass, where the compression geometry had a seam, not a crack. The Veth didn't make cracks. A seam, a deliberate edge, which meant someone had been let through. or had dug through, or had survived in some geometry the Veth deemed too small to bother with. She found the hatch by touch, running her fingers along the glass until the texture changed, pulled it open, went down. The space below was barely large enough to stand in. A survival cache, she realized. Pre-built, pre-stocked, the kind that colony engineers included in every major structure, not because anyone wanted to think about needing it, but because you always planned for the worst on a world that wasn't yours yet. In the cache were 3 months of compressed rations, a portable generator on its last charge, and a girl. She was perhaps 9 years old. Her hair had been cropped badly with a utility knife. She was wearing a survival suit 3 sizes too large, and she was clutching a metal disc in both hands, holding it to her chest the way you hold something you've decided is a talisman. Eyes were open, and they were looking at Mara, with the specific expression of someone who has been alone for so long that they have stopped expecting anyone to come. And now that someone has come, they don't quite know what the expression for that is. Mara sat down cross-legged on the floor of the cache, got herself at eye level, said nothing for a moment. "My name is Mara," she said finally. "What's yours?" The girl's name was Suki. She was 8, not 9. She had lost track. She had been in the cache for, she didn't know, a long time. She had kept the generator running by rationing its power to 6 hours a day. She had eaten the compressed rations in the precise order printed on the packaging, which she had memorized, which she recited for Mara in a flat voice, as if the recitation was a way of keeping order in a world that had become entirely disorder. She did not know what had happened to her family. She had been sent to the cache alone because her father had said he would follow, and he had not followed. Mara listened to all of it. She did not fill the silences. When Suki had run out of things to say, she held out the metal disc. It was a compass, Mara saw. An old magnetic compass, the kind someone had brought from Earth as a keepsake, useless on a terraformed planet because the magnetic north had been calibrated to the colony grid, not to anything natural. It pointed a direction that had been decided by people. It pointed home. "It was my dad's," Suki said. Mara took it, handed it back. "Keep it," she said. "It's yours." Above them in the atmosphere, 3 Veth observation vessels held a formation pattern they had maintained for 193 years. The Veth were a species of extraordinary patience, which they considered a virtue, and which the few humans who had studied them before the war considered something more like a pathology. They did not experience time the way humans did, not as a line moving forward, but as a depth, a density. An event 193 years old was not distant to them. It was simply deep. The Veth overseer, designated Tal Vorek Sem, watched the human's thermal signature on the surface and processed a sequence of observations that its predictive modeling classified as anomalous. The human had emerged from the survival installation, identified the destruction of its colony, and continued moving. This was consistent with tactical programming. Assess, adapt, continue, expected. Then, the human had stopped at the water reclamation array and spent 41 seconds doing nothing detectable by any Veth sensor suite. Not resting, not eating, not communicating, simply stopped and then continued. This was not consistent with tactical programming. And the Veth had an extremely comprehensive model of tactical programming. Then, the human had begun producing a low-frequency, oscillating sound from its respiratory system. Tal Vorek Sem knew humans produced sound for communication. It did not know humans produce sound for no apparent purpose, while alone, while working on a mechanical component, while not appearing to do anything with the sound at all. The sound had a repetitive structure, a pattern, that resembled communication protocols but did not match any recorded language, cipher, or distress code in the Veth database. It was, Mara knew, a song her mother had sung. She didn't remember the words. She wasn't sure there had ever been words she knew. It was just the shape of the melody, the rise and dip, the particular interval at the third bar that had always sounded like a question being asked and then answered in the same breath. She hummed it while she was stripping down the secondary power coupling on the weather array, rerouting it to boost the comm signal. Because humming helped her think, and thinking was, at this particular moment, the most valuable thing she had. She was trying to raise anyone, any signal, any wavelength. She had calculated, roughly, that a boosted short-range array might punch a signal as far as the Kepler relay station. If the relay station was still operational, if the Veth had left it operational, which they sometimes did, she knew, because the Veth occasionally found it useful to let humans communicate, the way you found it useful to leave the smaller animals in an ecosystem running because their activity told you things. Tal Voraxem delayed its scheduled atmospheric scan for 12 minutes while it continued observing. It was not supposed to delay the scan. It delayed it anyway, because the human was still producing the pattern sound, still working with a focus and a stillness that the Veth predictive model could not categorize, and Tal Voraxem had learned, over 193 years of observation, to pay close attention to things it could not categorize. Mara got the array up, sent the signal. Got nothing back. She sent it again, on a different frequency. Got nothing. She sent it 11 more times over the next 6 hours, on 11 different frequencies, logging each attempt, noting each failure with the same clerical precision she'd used to log supply requisitions before the war, before everything. Then she went back to the cache. Suki had eaten, had slept a little, was awake when Mara came back down, sitting against the wall with the compass in her lap, watching the needle. "Did you find anyone?" Suki asked. "Not yet," Mara said, "but you're going to keep trying." It wasn't a question. It was something else. A child reading an adult the way children do, when they have had to become very good at reading adults very fast. "Yes," Mara said. Why not challenging, genuinely curious? She had the manner of a child who had been thinking about this for a long time. Mara thought about it. The honest answer was not the protocol answer. She had been trained to say things like, "Because it's the mission and because we don't leave anyone behind," and those things were true, but they were only the surface of the true thing. Under them was something messier and less quotable. "'Cause," she said, "it's the only thing I know how to do that feels like it matters." Suki looked at the compass needle for a moment. "Dad said that about his work," she said. "He was an agronomist." "What does that mean? He grew things?" A pause. "He made things grow," Mara nodded. Ate a ration bar. Offered half to Suki, who took it without ceremony, the way children took things, when they had been surviving long enough to stop feeling guilty about needing things. On the 14th attempt on a frequency, Mara had almost skipped because the signal band was technically deprecated. Something answered. It wasn't human. It was a relay ping. Automated, ancient, the kind a beacon runs when it's been operating on backup power for so long that it no longer has the capacity for a full handshake, just a pulse. "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." But it was directional. It had a vector, and the vector was not toward deep space. It was toward the continent's interior, 240 kilometers north-northwest, somewhere in what had been the farming belt. Mara looked at the map she had reconstructed from memory and old colony survey data scratched onto the cache wall. She looked at the vector. She did a rough survival calculation in her head. 2 days on foot with a child, 3 if they moved carefully. The compressed rations, rationed hard, would last 5 days. The water reclamation tank couldn't travel. They'd need to find water. She started making a list. Suki watched her make the list and said, "Can I help?" "Yes," Smra said, and handed her a piece of survival blanket to write on. Voraxem reviewed the observations from the past 18 hours and filed an updated predictive assessment for the Tactical Council. The assessment was difficult to write. The Veth did not have easy language for things that fell outside their models, and this human fell outside several of them simultaneously. The Tactical Council had expected, after standard observation of survivor emergence, to see one of 3 behaviors: cessation, which was the statistically dominant outcome, evacuation attempt, which was the next most common, or territorial defense, which was the rarest and most dangerous. What it had not expected was what the human was actually doing, which did not map cleanly onto any of the 3 categories, and which could only be described, in the precise translation of the relevant behavioral clusters, as making a home. The Veth had no word for stubbornness. They had words for persistence and words for irrationality, and they tended to assume those 2 things were the same word. And the existence of something that was persistent and not irrational was philosophically uncomfortable. Tal Voraxem filed the assessment. Recommended continued observation. Recommended against intervention. The councils rejected the recommendation. They did not explain why. Mara and Suki left the cache before dawn, loaded with everything they could carry. Mara had stripped the portable generator for parts, the power cell, the coupling wire, the signal amplifier chip, and added them to a pack already built for someone larger. Suki carried the compass and a small pack, with rations and the survival blanket. She walked without complaining. She had apparently been walking without complaining for however long she'd been alive. It seemed baked in. The glass plane gave way gradually to the compressed margins. Zones where the Veth folding had been less complete. Where the ground was still something like soil under a skin of altered mineral. Things grew in the margins. Not human crops, but native flora. The creeping gray-green stuff that had been fighting the terraforming since day one, and had apparently been winning for the last 200 years. Mara ate some of it cautiously, didn't die, filed that in the column marked Options. On the second day, they found the Veth Forward Observer. It was alone, which was unusual. It stood about 2.5 meters tall, which was slightly below average for a Veth field unit. They ranged up to 4 meters, which was one of the things nobody had quite calculated into the initial tactical assessments, and which had made the first engagements deeply educational. This one was equipped for observation rather than compression. A sensor array across its thorax. No compression emitters. The pale latticework of its exoskeleton visible through the thin atmospheric membrane they wore like a second skin. It was standing in the middle of what had been a road. It was looking at them. Mara stopped, her hand out to stop Suki. They stood in the ruin of a broken intersection and looked at the Veth. And the Veth looked back at them. "Is that one of them?" Suki asked very quietly. "Yes, what do we do?" Mara did not have a good answer. She had a sidearm that would irritate a Veth the way a bee sting irritated a human. Noticeable, briefly, unpleasant, not decisive. She had no heavy ordnance. She had no cover and no useful terrain. What she had was two things. Time, because the Veth observer hadn't acted yet, which meant it was doing what its name said, observing. And the compass, in Suki's hand, which was pointing in exactly the direction they needed to go, which happened to be past the Veth. "We walk," Mara said. "Toward it, past it." Suki looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," she said. They walked. Mara kept her pace deliberate, and even. The same pace she'd walked since the installation, the walk she'd had since she was young. And people had told her it looked like she was going somewhere specific, even when she wasn't. She watched the thinner peripheral vision, without looking directly at it. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew the difference between awareness and aggression, and she wanted to perform the first without the second. They passed within 12 meters of it. The Veth did not move. When they were 30 meters past it, Mara heard the low-frequency click of a Veth sensor array adjusting. Still observing, it was sending something, she guessed, to whoever was watching from above. She began to hum. It was the same melody, the same song without words, the question and the answer, and the space between them. She hummed it not because she was unafraid. She was afraid. She was deeply and specifically afraid, in the way you were afraid when you had calculated the odds and they were bad, and you had decided to do the thing anyway. But because the humming helped, and because something in her wanted to be undisguisedly, unapologetically herself, in the 12 meters of space between a human and a thing that had compressed her entire world, in front of a child who was watching her closely and learning what the appropriate response to impossible odds was supposed to look like. She wanted it to look like this. The beacon was an old emergency communications unit, buried under 3 meters of collapsed farming structure, at the edge of what had been Crestfall Agri Station 7. It had been running on the colony's deep geothermal tap for 200 years, which was either extraordinary engineering or extraordinary luck, and Mara, who had learned to categorize those two things separately, wrote it down as engineering. Someone had built it to last. Someone had thought. The worst might happen, and after the worst there might still be someone listening, and that someone deserved a signal to follow. She dug it out. Suki helped, moving rubble with a methodical focus that Mara was beginning to understand was just who this child was. Careful, thorough, operating as if the task in front of her were the only task in existence. An agronomist's daughter. Someone who had been taught to tend things. The relay unit was intact, With the amplifier chip she'd stripped from the generator, she could extend its range from a local emergency beacon to a full colony broadcast. Not the relay station, but a signal strong enough to potentially bounce off the atmospheric satellites. If any were still up, if any still had reflective surfaces, if the Veth hadn't selectively deorbited them the way she suspected they might have. A lot of ifs. She worked through the night. Suki slept in a nest of survival blankets, the compass held loosely in one hand. Mara worked by the light of the beacon's status LEDs, blue and red, small enough to not be visible from above. She worked the way she always worked. In order, without rushing, acknowledging each problem as it presented and solving it before moving to the next one. She replaced the coupling wire. She rewired the amplifier. She coded a simple repeating message in the old broadcast standard that anyone alive who had grown up in the outer colonies would know how to read. She thought about what to say. She thought about the robot from the old animation, who had completed its task and stood in the completion and felt nothing, because the task had been the wrong thing to chase. The task was not the thing. The task was just the vehicle for the thing. You built the relay not because the relay mattered, but because someone on the other end of it might matter. You walked across the glass plane not because protocol said to assess, but because somewhere under the glass, there might be a girl with a compass pointing home. She coded the message. This is Specialist First Class Mara Vasquez, CC Defense Detachment 7 Kep 442B. Cryo Revival Day 3. Colony destroyed, survivor located, child age 8 healthy. Beacon operational at coordinates to follow. We are here, we are staying. Come when you can, she sent it. Then she sat back and listened to the silence, and looked at the space above her where the sky had turned from the color of an old scar to something closer to the color of twilight. Not the twilight of Earth, which she barely remembered, but the twilight of this world, which had a quality the colonists had spent years trying to describe and had, finally, mostly agreed on. It looked like permission, like the sky was saying, okay, you can rest now, you can be here. This counts. On the third morning, Tal Vorek-Sem filed a second assessment, and this time did not include a recommendation, because the council had made it clear that recommendations regarding the human would be reviewed on a longer timeline. The assessment contained, in the section reserved for behavioral classification, a phrase that had never appeared in a Veth tactical document before. The direct translation was approximately, pernescent without objective, action arising from condition of being rather than condition of strategy. There was a Veth concept, ancient and rarely invoked, for the behavior of organisms that continued to exist simply because existence was the thing they were doing, not because they had calculated it as the optimal path. The concept had been considered a synonym for damage, a malfunction, a broken goal state. The assessment listed it, and for the first time in any Veth record concerning the humans of Kepler 442b, listed it under the heading, Threat Assessment. Broken goal state was predictable. You could model a broken thing. You could account for it. What you could not account for was a thing that was not broken, that had simply decided to define its goals differently than you assumed all functional things defined goals. What you could not account for was a thing that had lost everything it was protecting and was still, somehow, protecting things. The Council authorized a 24-hour hold on compression operations in Sector 7. It did not say why. The response came on the 7th day. Not from the relay station, not from a rescue fleet, not from anything Mara had specifically anticipated. It came from a colony transport she had not known was in the system, a cargo runner that had been hiding in the shadow of the planet's smaller moon for an unspecified period, running cold, waiting for a signal. There were 31 people on it. Survivors from 2 other colonies on the other continent. They had been hiding for years. They came down in a small atmospheric shuttle, running low and fast over the farming belt. And when they landed in the rubble of Agri Station 7, the first person off the shuttle was a man in his mid-40s, with an agronomist's calluses on his hands, and a face that had been doing the arithmetic of hope and despair. For so long it had settled into a particular stillness that Mara recognized, because she had been wearing it herself. He saw Suki before Suki saw him. Mara stepped back. She didn't know she was going to cry until it happened, and it happened quietly. The way things happened with her. Not a collapse. just a release. The way a seal bleeds pressure when you finally crack the valve. She turned her face away from the reunion and looked at the sky, the perfusion-colored sky, and breathed. Shh. She was still crying when the transport's crew chief found her. He was a big man, older, with the kind of face that had been many places and kept a record. He looked at her for a moment and didn't say anything. Then he said, "You sent the signal." "Yes. We'd been sitting up there for 3 months," he said, trying to figure out if it was safe to move, trying to figure out what safe even meant anymore. "Did you figure it out?" He looked out at the ruins around them, the compressed glass plane, the pale sky. "No," he said, "but someone on the ground decided to stay, and that seemed like a data point." Mara almost laughed. It came out wrong. He didn't seem to mind. There were 31 people now, 32 counting Suki, 33 counting Mara. 33 people on a world that had been folded and compressed and categorized by its conquerors, as resolved, finished, no longer requiring attention. 33 people in the ruins of Agri Station 7 with a functional beacon and a water reclamation unit and a geothermal tap still cycling power into the ground. Mara walked the perimeter of the station while the others were still sorting themselves out, still doing the work of 33 people who had been alone or nearly alone for years and were now not alone, the overwhelming, disorienting work of that. She walked because walking was what she did. She carried the kit because the kit was what she carried. She looked at the land. The compressed land, the alien-touched land, the land that had been folded into silence, and was, it turned out, still land, still dirt under the glass, still geothermal energy in its belly, still native vegetation growing stubbornly in the margins, the way native vegetation always did. She stopped at the eastern edge, where the glass plane met the margin growth. The creeping gray-green was thick here. She crouched and looked at it. Thought about what the agronomist had said. He grew things. He made things grow. She pulled her field knife and took a sample, weighed it in her hand. It was edible. She had established that. It grew fast. She had observed that. It was native to this planet. It had been here before the terraforming, and it would be here after. And what that meant was that the planet's ecosystem had not been broken by the Veth. Only its human structures had. The planet itself was still doing what planets did. She put the sample in her kit, stood up, looked at the sky. Psst. The Veth observation vessels were still up there. She could not see them, but she knew they were there. She knew because she could feel the quality of being watched, which she had been feeling since day one, and had stopped treating as a threat, and started treating as information. They were watching because they could not predict her. She had become, somehow, in the process of just doing the next thing and then the next thing, something the Veth had not modeled. She did not know what the Veth word for that was. She suspected there wasn't one. She hoped that was useful. She went back to the group. Suki was talking. Actually talking. In the way she hadn't quite managed in the cache. Words coming out faster than she'd been allowing them to. Her father's hand on her shoulder. Her hands moving as she spoke. The compass was still in her pocket. Mara could see the small rectangular shape of it against the fabric. The crew chief found her again by the beacon. He was holding 2 cups of something hot that he'd made from the transport's emergency supplies. "Talking about options," he said. "Most people think we should load up and try for the relay station. See if there's anything left in the inner system. And you?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a geothermal tap here. There's water. There's native vegetation that turns out to be edible. There's a beacon." He handed her a cup. There was one person who decided to stay. Mara held the cup with both hands. It was warm, genuinely warm, and she let herself feel it. "The Veth haven't moved in 5 days," she said. "Not since I started sending signals. Something we're doing is confusing them." "What are we doing?" "Living," she said. "Specifically, living without apparent strategic purpose from their perspective. They can model a fight. They can model a retreat. They haven't yet figured out how to model 33 people deciding to be here." He thought about that. "You think that's an advantage?" "I think it's the only one we have." He drank from his cup. "I used to build things," he said. "Before. Infrastructure, colony grade. I know how to read a geothermal survey. The station has one. 30 years old, but the geology hasn't changed." "No," he said. "Geology doesn't change fast." Neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that they were standing in the ruins of a world and talking about building in it, which was an objectively unreasonable thing to do, which was possibly the most human thing available to them, which was possibly the same statement made twice. They started the next morning. Not with construction. Not yet. That was weeks away. That was materials assessment and site surveys, and the hard, careful work of figuring out what the ground could hold and what it couldn't. They started with something smaller. They cleared a space in the rubble, roughly circular, large enough for 33 people to sit without crowding. They did this by hand, because they had hands and they had time, and because the act of clearing a space was the act of saying, "We are putting something here. Something is going to be here. This is not finished." Suki helped carry rubble. Her father helped. The crew chief helped. Everyone helped. Mara worked at the edge of the circle, stacking stones into a low border. Not a wall, just a marker, just the beginning of a shape. She worked with focus and without hurrying. At some point she began to hum. The melody without words, the question and the answer. And she didn't notice she was doing it until she heard, faintly, from across the clearing, someone else humming the same thing. She looked up. The crew chief shrugged. "My mother used to sing that," he said. "Didn't know you knew it." "I don't know it," she said. "Not the words." "Neither did she, actually," he said. "She'd heard it somewhere. It gets around. It gets around." Mara thought about that. About all the people who had carried that melody without knowing its name, had hummed it to themselves in cryo chambers and survival caches, and the ruins of compressed colonies, had passed it on without meaning to. The Veth had no word for what that was. The Veth had compressed an entire world, and they had not compressed that. They did not know it existed. They could not model it, because they had not thought to look for it. She stacked another stone. Suki came and sat beside her and watched. "Are we going to be okay?" Suki asked. Mara thought about the honest answer. About all the things she did not know, which were vast, and all the things she did know, which were small. She thought about the beacon, and the geothermal tap and the gray-green vegetation growing in the margins. She thought about 33 people choosing to stay. She thought about the Veth, hovering in the sky, watching, and not knowing what to do with what they were seeing. "I don't know," she said. Suki nodded, as if that were the answer she had expected, and the answer she preferred to a less honest one. "You're staying," she said. "Yes, then I am too." The compass was in her hand again. It pointed north-northwest, toward nothing in particular, toward a direction that had been decided by people. Mara looked at it, looked at the circle they were building, looked at the sky, where the Veth were watching and not moving, held in place by something they could not name. She picked up another stone. She placed it in the wall. She hummed.